James the Just led the church, but was not an apostle. Now, why would that be? So to answer that question, a far more relevant question needs to be asked first. See, why have we been brought up to accept that as a reality? Is it because that is what the scriptures actually teach? Well, we're going to try and find out. See, we ended the last video with a question about an apostle we are told Jesus chose, named James, son of Alphaeus. Now, this James appears in 3 gospel lists of the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, plus in the book of Acts. Now, the Gospel of John never mentions him. So apart from those 4 occasions, the Bible never mentions him again. Now, no stories, or any dialogue anywhere in the New Testament. Now, I find this, really somewhat strange. After all, we're talking here of one of the 12 foundation pillars of the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21 and verse 14. And yet the scriptures say nothing else of him except part of that list. He was just part of that list. Now, on the other hand, we have another James, known as James the Just, the brother of Jesus, Galatians 1 and verse 19. Now, this James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Acts 15, 13 through to 20, the Apostle Peter acknowledged this James, and he does so in Acts 12 and verse 17. Then we have this rather strange account where Jesus was first taken following his arrest, from Gethsemane. John 18 and verse 13, and then 15 and 16. I'm going to read that. They brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Now, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he also went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside, at the door. Then the disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. So, who was this other disciple of Jesus who had such influence within the priesthood, who the guards to the high priest would accept his authority and allow a Galilean fisherman into the courtyard of the high priest's father-in-law? Remember, this was where the guards first brought Jesus, not to high priest Caiaphas, but to his father-in-law, Annas. Now, who do you think was controlling the priesthood then? The high priest or his father-in-law? Also, we would have to had such authority, this one, as to allow a Galilean fisherman into the courtyard of this powerful person. Another Galilean fisherman? Really? Let's keep our thinking caps on, please. Now, we're going to move to Sunday morning of that same week, right? And note another strange event. John chapter 20 and verses 3 through to 8. Then Peter, the other disciple, set out from the tomb. The 2 were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down, looked in at the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Simon Peter arrived just after him, entered the tomb, and saw the linen cloths lying there. The cloth that had been really around Jesus' head, it was rolled up, lying separate from the linen cloths. Now, then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and he believed. Now, why does this other disciple hesitate, as recorded in verse 5? And then only after Simon Peter went in, as verse 8 says, and he saw and believed. What was it that he came to believe? See, the writer himself gives us a clue in verse 9. John chapter 20 and verse 9. For they did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Now, if this other disciple was associated with the temple in any way, then the purification laws in Numbers 19:11 through to 16 would have prevented him from serving in the temple for 7 days had he entered. Even entering the room of a dead person would have rendered him unclean for 7 days. Now, this would not have bothered Peter, but this other disciple? See, are we connecting some spiritual dots here? Now, that would explain the hesitation, would it not? Because he then goes in after Peter. But why after Peter? Because the writer said he believed. Believed what, though? Well, if there was a dead body, the headcloth would still be on the body. But it wasn't. That could only mean one thing. This was not the cave of a dead person, but one who was very much alive. And that is what caused this other disciple to believe that Jesus was very much alive. He was not in the room of a dead body, so there was no need anymore to hesitate. Now there was another clue from the writer, John chapter 20 and verses 15 and 16. Woman, why are you weeping? Jesus asked. Whom are you seeking? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. And Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which of course means teacher. Now, Rabbi appears frequently. The disciples and others often address Jesus in this way. John 1 and verse 38 is just one example. Go and check. Jesus himself noted that the religious leaders liked to be called Rabbi. Matthew 23, 5 through to 7. But Rabboni only occurs twice. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 51, where the blind Bartimaeus addresses Jesus in that way. And Mary Magdalene, when she recognized the risen Jesus, she used it. It was a far more intense and personal expression. Now, after 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, these sort of expressions took on a more formal sort of clerical title. See, these Gospels were written after 70 CE, really late into the 1st century. Now, with all these clues, are we really convinced with the idea that this other disciple was the Apostle John, as we have been conditioned to think? Well, you decide. You know where my thinking is. So the question remains then, who was this other disciple? Now, we have been given, really a lot of clues, haven't we? There had to be someone with whom the ones guarding Jesus regarded with respect and authority. John 18:16. Now just ask yourself, is it likely that a Galilean fisherman living out in Galilee with no formal Jerusalem connections would be this other disciple? Okay, let's take another clue. John chapter 20 and verses 3 to 8. Why did this other disciple hesitate at the cave entrance? Well, we discussed that quite rationally, didn't we, around the purity laws of Numbers 19:11 through to 16. Thereby, of course, indicating that this other disciple was closely tied to the temple arrangement, possibly even a priest. Then again, of course, Mary Magdalene's response to Jesus. When she realized he was not the gardener, "Rabboni," she calls out. Then we have, well, in my personal opinion, the real clincher. See, when about to die on the cross or the stake, whichever way you want to look at it, we have Jesus' words as recalled by the writer of John. John 19, verse 26. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." He then said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." So from that hour, this disciple took her into his home. Now, who else would Jesus have passed on responsibility for his own mother's welfare than to another, than the most natural person in the world, his brother, the next oldest? And the writer, recounting this, adds the icing to the cake, describing him, this other disciple, as the one whom he, that's Jesus, loved. And then this disciple just happened to have his residence in Jerusalem, where all these events were taking place. But how do we know that this disciple's residence was actually in Jerusalem? Well, Luke, of all people, tells us, Acts chapter 21, 17 and 18. When we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us joyfully. The next day, Paul went in with us to see James at his home, and all the elders were present. The meetings always took place in homes then. They had no formal meeting buildings at all. So James's residence had to be either in or very near Jerusalem, and certainly not in Galilee. Now, what have we noticed about these pieces of information? See, the main points come from just one source, the Gospel of John. Now, for those who've been following this channel, you will appreciate that we have had sort of two previous series 5 and Series 8, where we discuss various parts of this Gospel, and really for good reasons, because there is a wealth of information to be found in this Gospel, both good and also some of it really highly questionable. Example, John 1 and verse 1. Now, the good treasure that we've picked out in this episode relates to this other disciple, or the disciples that Jesus loved. Now, all the information we have looked at so far really points in one direction, doesn't it? James the Just, as he come to be known. However, there is one outstanding difficulty that needs to be overcome, and that reflects itself in the title of this video. Why was James not an apostle? How can James the Just, brother of Jesus, who led the congregation for the first 30 years till his death in about 62 CE, how could he not have been an appointed apostle by Jesus himself? How could that have been? But the list of appointed men appearing in the 3 synoptic Gospels and Acts does not list him as an apostle. Yet, a certain Matthias was appointed to replace Judas Iscariot, and not this James the Just, who was actually the leader of the church or the congregation. Clearly, there's something wrong with the narrative that has been handed down to us, isn't there? Especially when there is no scriptural information that is available to us about this other individual, James, the son of Alphaeus, or even his father, Alphaeus. Now, scholars have tried to make guesses about him, But really, that's all we have. Guesses. So let's stand back and try and get an overall picture of the book of Acts of the Apostles, which of course is attributed to the writer Luke. First point of note. If this was to be an historical analysis of the Acts of the Apostles, all of them, why did it only concentrate on two individuals, Paul and Peter, and of course in particular, Paul? See, was the writer Luke really trying to put together an historical narrative of the work and the spread of the early congregation? Was that his task? Now, we can safely say that Acts 1 through to 8 featured both Peter and John. And then Acts 13 through to 28 is all about Paul. Now, in the last video we showed how the other apostles really carried the bulk of the work of taking the message of Jesus to the ends of the earth. So, is Acts a genuine historical narrative? Well, I would say hardly. And another agenda must have been at work here. The question is what? See now, if we carefully examine the books, it is very interesting what facts turn up. How many times is the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, how many times is he mentioned? Well, the fact is several times, as it turns out, but almost always in connection with Peter. And of course there is the one occasion, Acts 1 and verse 13, along with the other apostles named. Then with Peter, Acts 3 verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, and verse 11. Sorry, Acts 3 verse 1. See, John is Peter's partner in the first big miracle, the healing of the lame man. Acts 3 and verses 2 right through to 11. Just go and read it again, please. Then he is arrested with Peter and brought before the Sanhedrin, Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. Then he is sent by the congregation to Samaria, Acts chapter 8 and verse 14. And after that, he is not mentioned again. So in total we have him mentioned about 9 times. Now, what about Peter? Well, actually, it's about 54 times by name and more than that by pronoun. Now, I will give you all the scriptures, if you are of that sort of mindset. Now, what about Paul? Well, as Saul, from Acts chapter 7 right through to 9, he is mentioned 25 times. Where he first shows up, really holding the coats at Stephen's stoning. Then as Saul, a teacher in Antioch, he's mentioned 4 times. This is in Acts chapter 11 through to Acts chapter 12. Then as Paul himself, as we've come to know him, from Acts chapter 13 and verse 7 through to 28 and verse 31, he's mentioned some 134 times. So, across all of the book of Acts, John, the Apostle John, is mentioned 9 times. Peter is mentioned 56 times. Paul, either as Saul or Paul, is mentioned 159 times. Now note this. The leader of the congregation, James, is just mentioned 3 times in Acts chapter 12:17 when Peter reports to him. Acts 15:13, he presides over the Jerusalem council. And Acts 21 verse 18 when Paul reports to him. And that's it. Luke doesn't mention him again anywhere else. And he never calls him the brother of Jesus. And he only mentions Mary, Jesus' mother, the mother of the family, is only mentioned once in Acts 1 and verse 14. And this, the most important family on the earth. So was Luke trying or writing an actual history of the movement started by the Messiah Jesus, or was he writing and focusing on Paul and his theology? Now, the problem Luke had was that he was trying to put history through a very narrow lens of Paul. And he was very aware, really, that a certain one, and this is John the Apostle, was actually still alive while he was producing this. So he could not ignore the actual facts of history that he was purporting to write about, because there was a major eyewitness who was still around. But of course, additionally, there were some 30 years of James as the head of the movement that had solidified in the experience and culture of the Hebrew followers of Jesus. So, what was Luke's actual assignment? That's a good question, isn't it? Because this Acts of the Apostle wasn't really about the apostles. The evidence simply does not bear that out. So, does Luke's assignment have anything to do with this mysterious figure that we've come to know as Theophilus? After all, both the Gospel and Acts were written to this individual, Theophilus. But for what purpose? Did both Apostles Peter and John fit into that purpose? And also this, James the son of Alphaeus, was he actually a real person? Now, we'll take the evidence of all of these ones, really, and see what conclusions can be drawn. But we're going to do that in the next episode. So, until then, thanks once again for watching, and see you next time.